Putin could have avoided the war in the Ukraine. His invasion was illegal, it was unnecessary, and it was brutal. But I think it's important for us to move beyond these kind of comic book depictions of of this insane, avaricious Russian leader who wants to, restore the Soviet Empire, and that's why, and who made an unprovoked invasion of the Ukraine. He was provoked, and we were provoking him, for since 1997. And it's not just me that's saying that. I mean, before Putin ever came in, we were provoking the Russians in this way unnecessarily. And to go back that time in 1992, when the Russians moved out of, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Russians moved out of East Germany. And they did that, which was a huge concession to them. They had 400,000 troops in East Germany at that time, and they were facing NATO troops on the other side of the wall. So Gorbachev made this huge concession where he said to George Bush, I'm going to move all of our troops out, and you can then reunify Germany under NATO, which was a hostile army to the Soviet. It was created to, with hostile intent toward the Soviet Union. And he said, you can take Germany, but I want your promise that you will not move NATO to the east. And James Baker, who was his Secretary of State, famously said, I will not move NATO. We will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. So then 5 years later, in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was kind of the father of the neocons, who was a Democrat at that time, served in the Carter administration, he said he published a paper, a blueprint for moving NATO right up to the Russian border, 1,000 miles to the east, and taking over 14 nations. And at that time, George Kennan, who was the kind of the deity of American diplomats, he was probably arguably the most important diplomat in American history. He was the architect of the containment policy during World War II. And he said, this is insane and it's unnecessary. And if you do this, it's going to provoke the Russians to a violent response. And we should be making friends with the Russians. They lost the Cold War. We should be treating them the way that we treated our adversaries after World War II, like with a Marshall Plan to try to help them incorporate into Europe and to be part of the brotherhood of man and of Western nations. We shouldn't continue to be treating them as an enemy and particularly surrounding them at their borders. William Perry, who was then the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, threatened to resign. He was so upset by this plan to move NATO to the east. And William Burns, who was then the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who's now, at this moment, the head of the CIA, said at that time the same thing. If you do this, it is going to provoke the Russians toward a military response. And we moved it. We moved all around Russia. We moved to 14 nations, 1,000 miles to the east, and we put Aegis missile systems in 2 nations in Romania and Poland. So we did what the Russians had done to us in 1962 that would have provoked an invasion of Cuba. We put those missile systems back there, and then we walk away unilaterally, from the 2 nuclear missile treaties, the intermediate nuclear missile treaties that we had with Russia. And neither of us would put those missile systems on the borders. We walk away from that, and we put Aegis missile systems, which are nuclear capable. They can carry the Tomahawk missiles, which have nuclear warheads. So the last country that they didn't take was the Ukraine. And the Russians said, and in fact, Bill Perry said this, or William Burns said it, this is now the head of the CIA. It is a red line. If we bring NATO into Ukraine, that is a red line for the Russians. They cannot live with it. Russia has been invaded 3 times through the Ukraine. The last time it was invaded, the Germans killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. They destroyed. My uncle described what happened to Russia in his famous American University speech in 1963, 60 years ago this month, or last month, 60 years ago in June 10th, 1963, he told that speech was telling the American people, put yourself in the shoes of the Russians. We need to do that if we're gonna make peace. And he said, all of us have been taught, that we won the war, but we didn't win the war. The Russians, if anybody won the war against Hitler, it was the Russians. Their country was destroyed.